Now, the greatest radio shows of all time.
Suspense.
The Shadow Node.
Washington calling David Harding, counter-spy.
Classic radio theater.
The Great Gildersleeve.
Fibber McGee and Molly.
Dragnet. Gunsmoke.
The Lone Ranger.
Now, step back into a time machine with your host, Wyatt Cox.
Good evening, friends of the Inner Sanctum.
Bennett Kilpack in the much satirized Mr. Keen Tracer of Lost Persons, going back 73 years to November 10th, 1949, and the Engaged Girl murder case. And we thank you for joining us on this sure happy it's Thursday, 10th day of November, 314th day of the year, 51 days left till we get to 2023. The last colonial governor of New Jersey, William Franklin, signed the charter of Queens College on this date in 1766. It would later be renamed Rutgers University. Continental Congress passed a resolution in 1775 creating 2 battalions of Continental Marines. They would later be renamed the U.S. Marine Corps to serve as landing troops for the recently created Continental Navy. Now, the first National Convention of the American Legion held in Minneapolis on this date in 1919, and it was on this date in 1938, Kate Smith, on her weekly radio program, sang Irving Berlin's God Bless America for the very first time. Direct dial coast-to-coast telephone service began in the U.S. on this date in 1951.
Direct distance dialing. And what's direct distance dialing? Well, let's see. Here's a telephone call being dialed. A simple operation that occurs thousands of times a day. But this is no ordinary telephone call. For with each turn of the dial, electronic impulses speed along miles of wire or pass swiftly as light from relay tower to relay tower to span half the nation. In a distant city, a few seconds after the dialing begins, a telephone rings. And 2 voices have been joined by one of the most amazing communications advances of our time, direct distance dialing, or DDD.
An excerpt from a 1959 Southwestern Bell film promoting the news service. In 1969, National Educational Television, the predecessor to the public broadcasting service in the U.S., debuted Sesame Street. The ore-hauling ship Edmund Fitzgerald sank during a storm in Lake Superior on this date in 1975. All 29 crew members died. Yes, there really was an Edmund Fitzgerald. The newly finished Vietnam Veterans Memorial opened to its first visitors in Washington in 1982. And in 1997, WorldCom and MCI Communications announced a $37 billion merger on this date in 1997, the largest merger in history at the time.
We are excited by the remarkable opportunities this combination makes possible for both companies, shareholders, customers, and employees. The combined company creates one of the world's leading fully integrated communications companies. The combined company will be exceptionally well positioned to take advantage of growth opportunities in the $670 billion telecommunications market.
Bernard Ebbers, president and CEO of WorldCom, the company declared bankruptcy in 2002 after a series of accounting scandals. Corporation purchased by Verizon Communications. The deal finalized in January of 2006. That is now the company's Verizon Enterprise Solutions division. Local residential divisions slowly integrated into local Verizon subsidiaries. The conviction of 19-year-old British au pair Louise Woodward, we told you about a few weeks ago, in 1997, reduced from second-degree murder to involuntary manslaughter. Her sentence reduced from life in prison to time served. She had been found guilty less than 2 weeks earlier in a baby-shaking death. 2001, the World Trade Organization approved China's membership. 2004, Mozilla Firefox released. In 2006, the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Quantico, Virginia opened and dedicated by President George W. Bush, who announced Marine Corps Jason Dunham posthumously would receive the Medal of Honor for actions served while in the Iraq War. While on a patrol his unit attacked, he deliberately covered an enemy grenade to save nearby Marines. And in 2008, over 5 months after landing on Mars, NASA declared the Phoenix mission concluded after communications with the lander were lost. Among those passing away on this date in history, the fourth head of state of the Soviet Union, Leonid Brezhnev, William Atlas, better known to millions of wrestling fans as Dick the Bruiser, actor Chuck Connors, singer, pianist, actress Carmen McRae, also boxer actor Jack Palance, actress Lorraine Day, author Norman Mailer, and actor, producer, production manager Dino De Laurentiis. This is the birth date of Protestant reformer Martin Luther, also actor Claude Rains, the professor on Gilligan's Island, Russell Johnson, Welsh actor Richard Burton, actor Roy Schneider, the Japanese singer Kyu Sakamoto, who sang a wonderful and had a top 10 hit with a wonderful love song in Japanese. Unfortunately, the record labels decided to call it Sukiyaki. And Brittany Murphy, all those folks born on this date in history. Happy birthday number 77 to the happiest girl in the whole USA. Donna Fargo, 77 today. Kenny Loggins' second cousin, the guy who sang about asking you to please come to Boston. Dave Loggins, 75 today. Comedian Sinbad, 66, from One Day at a Time, and the daughter of John Phillips and the Mamas and the Papas. Mackenzie Phillips, 63, also from Saturday Night Live, 30 Rock, and The Last OG. Tracy Morgan, 54, from Grey's Anatomy. Ellen Pompeo is 53. Country's Miranda Lambert, 39. And from Mad Men and The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina and Riverdale, Kiernan Shipka is 23. Those some of the people celebrating the 10th day of November is their birthday. If this is your birthday...
Hi, we're the Four Freshmen, and we just want to say... Happy birthday to you!
And from 73 years ago today, November 10th, 1949, Bennett Kilpack as Mr. Keen, Tracer of Lost Persons, on this Thursday Classic Radio Theater with Wyatt Cox. Tons of satires were made of this program. Mr. Keen, Tracer of Lost Persons, Bob and Ray did it. A lot of people satired this to simply the title. And I myself, I always wonder, if Mr. Keen was a tracer of lost persons, why was he always dealing with murder cases? And that was one of the things that, well, the answer probably most simply is, if you had Mr. Keen, Murder Hunter, that wouldn't have sold. But Tracer of Lost Persons, they figured, was safe enough. So this episode of Mr. Keen was originally broadcast 73 years ago, November 10th, 1949. It's the engaged girl murder case here on Classic Radio Theater with Wyatt Cox.
It's time now for Mr. Keen, Tracer of Lost Persons.
Ladies and gentlemen, Anderson and Kalinos present Mr. Keen, Tracer of Lost Persons, one of the most famous characters of American fiction in one of radio's most thrilling dramas. Tonight and every Thursday at the same time, the famous old investigator takes from his file and brings to us one of his most celebrated missing persons cases. Tonight's case is entitled The Engaged Girl Murder Case. For Mr. Keen and the Engaged Girl Murder Case. Our scene opens on a wealthy, fashionable estate in Connecticut. A number of people are riding across the estate on horseback, but two of them have fallen behind, not realizing that they are both about to become participants in a tragedy.
Better hurry, Audrey. The others are getting ahead of us.
Herbert, wait. Let's walk the horses a bit. I want to talk to you, and this is the first chance I've had to see you alone all day.
Oh, what's the matter, darling? You look concerned about something.
I am concerned. About your sister, Martha.
Martha?
Herbert, I don't think she wants you to marry me.
But that's sheer nonsense. Martha's very fond of you.
She pretends to be in front of you. But I believe she hates me.
Now, Audrey, don't you think you're being oversensitive?
Herbert, I know how much you love your sister, and I didn't imagine you'd believe me, but it's true, and I just can't...
What's that? It sounds like one of our dogs. Yes, it is. It's Sultan, my sister's dog. There he is, Audrey, near that clearing. Come on, let's ride over there. Sultan, what's the matter, boy?
Herbert, look!
It's my sister, Martha, lying in a thicket. Hold my horse while I dismount, Audrey.
What's happened, Herbert? Has she been hurt?
Audrey, she's been struck on the head. Martha's dead. The police said, Mr. Keene, that someone must have struck my sister Martha on top of the head with a heavy club and killed her instantly.
This occurred while you and your guests were out riding, Mr. Langley?
Yes.
Was your sister Martha part of the group who were on horseback?
Yes, I thought she'd gone on ahead with the others.
Well, hitting a horseback rider on the head with a club when you stand on the ground, well, that ain't an easy trick. Somebody on a horse must have followed the girl and struck her from the saddle.
My partner, Mike Clancy, has a good point there, Mr. Langley. Tell me, were all your guests questioned by the local police?
Yes, Mr. Keene, but none of them was held. They were all Martha's close friends and mine. It's unthinkable that any of them would have wanted to harm her in any way.
In other words, you can't put the finger of suspicion on any of them.
No, Mr. Keene. My sister Martha was a beautiful, intelligent woman. Very popular with men, though she never married. I loved her as much as I've ever loved anyone in this world. With the exception of Audrey, perhaps.
Mr. Langley, tell me a little more about your fiancée, Audrey Stafford.
She's a wonderful girl. We met last summer on a cruise to Bermuda. She was on vacation at the time. She worked for a banking firm. But she resigned her position at my request shortly after we announced our engagement.
I see.
I'm wealthy. My late father left his entire estate to my sister Martha and to me. I didn't think it was necessary for my future wife to retain her job.
Well, what about that incident you mentioned when you told us the story before, Mr. Langley?
What incident, Mr. Clancy?
I imagine Mike is referring to your talk with your fiancée, Audrey, just before you found your sister's body, the talk concerning her unfriendly attitude toward Audrey.
That was nothing. I shouldn't even have brought it up.
Mr. Langley, I presume you came here to ask me to solve the mystery of your sister's murder.
Yes, Mr. Keene. I came to plead with you to enter the case for Martha's sake.
And also for Audrey's?
What do you mean?
From what you told me, Mr. Langley, I imagine there is one suspect in this murder case.
You mean my fiancée?
Yes. You said that Audrey told you that Martha was against your marriage.
But Audrey would never have murdered my sister for that, or for any reason.
That still remains a question to be answered. However, I can't accept the case, Mr. Langley, unless you tell me everything, openly and truthfully.
I should have known better than to try to hide my real feelings from you, sir. Yes, I want Audrey protected. So far, no one knows that she quarreled with Martha before the murder.
Over you?
Yes, Mr. Keene. I overheard the argument. I said nothing to Audrey, thinking it would pass over after the wedding.
Why did your sister want to stop the marriage, Mr. Langley?
For a very silly reason. Martha thought Audrey wanted to marry me for my money. I never believed that, Mr. Keene, and I never will.
At the same time, if I accept the case, you must be prepared to have me include your fiancée as a possible suspect.
I understand that, Mr. Keene, and I'm willing to meet those terms.
All right. Now, how far is your estate from here?
It's just over the line in Connecticut.
Oh, excuse me. Mr. Keene's office. Mike Clancy speaking.
Is Mr. Herbert Langley there, please? This is Mrs. Wrightson, his housekeeper.
Just a minute. Your housekeeper, Mr. Langley.
Oh, yes, I told her where I'd be in case there were any messages. It must be important.
Well, here you are.
Thank you, Mr. Clancy. Hello?
Mr. Langley, this is Mrs. Wrightson.
Yes?
Mr. Ernest Porter's here to see you. He says it's very urgent, and he wants to know when you'll be home.
Is he near the phone, Mrs. Wrightson?
No, he stepped out in the garden.
Tell him I expect to be home within an hour. Mr. Porter didn't say what his business was, did he?
No, sir, but he acted like it was a matter of life and death.
All right, Mrs. Wrightson, I'm on my way. Goodbye.
Goodbye, Mr. Langley.
It's a neighbor of mine named Porter, Mr. Keene. He seems to have something terribly important to tell me.
Who is he, Mr. Langley?
He has an estate near mine. He and his nephew, Alan, come over quite often. Can't imagine what he's got in his mind. Unless it refers to my sister Martha's murder.
It probably does. The sooner we find out just what it is, the better. Mike Clancy and I will go with you to your home right now.
Well, just a moment, Mr. Keene. I have a key to the front door.
Well, Mike, while I'm inside the house, suppose you take a look around. You know, the usual checkup.
Right, sir. Come in, Mr. Keene.
Oh, Mr. Langley, I didn't hear you come in.
This is Mr. Keene, Mrs. Wrightson. Mrs. Wrightson, my housekeeper.
I've heard of Mr. Keene, the great investigator. I'm very glad to know you, sir.
How do you do, Mrs. Wrightson?
Where's Mr. Porter?
In the study.
Well, Mr. Keene and his partner, Mr. Clancy, will be staying overnight. Would you have one of the maids prepare a room?
Of course, Mr. Langley. Oh, Miss Audrey called. She said she's coming out to see you at 5 o'clock.
Well, it's almost that now. Show her in when she arrives, please.
Yes, sir.
This way, Mr. Keene.
Well, this is quite a handsome house you have here, Mr. Langley.
It's been in the family for generations. Oh, here's Mr. Porter.
Herbert, I want to speak to you alone.
This is Mr. Keene, the famous investigator, Ernest.
Mr. Keene? You mean he's taken over the investigation of your sister's murder?
Yes.
Well, then I suppose I ought to say what I have to say in front of him.
I think you should, Mr. Porter, if it concerns the murder of Martha Langley.
It does, Mr. Keene.
Then what is it you want to tell us?
Well, I have a nephew, Alan, of whom I'm very fond. He's been living with me since his parents died. And I'd stand behind him under any circumstances.
What are you trying to say, Mr. Porter?
Mr. Keene, you can accuse me for that matter or anyone else who was along on that morning ride. My nephew's innocent and completely honest.
What are you driving at, Ernest?
I think I know what Mr. Porter's trying to say, Mr. Langley. Apparently his nephew, Alan, is connected with your sister's murder in some way. And Mr. Porter is attempting to clear him, even before he's been accused.
Mr. Keene, knowing you for what you are, a fair man, I don't mind putting my cards on the table. My nephew, Alan, came to me today and confessed that he was the first one to find Martha's body.
You mean he found her there near the woods before I did?
Apparently, Herbert.
How did he happen to find Martha's body, Mr. Porter?
Well, he dropped behind the rest of us as we were riding through the woods. The reason he said nothing about it up to now was that he didn't want to become involved, Mr. Keene.
That's not a very good excuse.
The boy was excited, frightened perhaps. At any rate, he admitted the truth, didn't he?
Yes, and it's in his favor. Mr. Porter, is there anything else you wanted to say to Mr. Langley?
No. Except that he has my deepest sympathy.
I appreciate that, Ernest, and thanks. In recent months, you and my sister Martha have become fast friends, and I know you miss her, as we all do.
In recent months, did you say?
Well, Mr. Keene, Martha Langley and I were better than friends. I dared to hope that she would marry me.
I didn't know that, Ernest.
I said nothing, Herbert, because she turned me down. It was too bad. Both our families are rich and would have been a most advantageous marriage, as well as a happy one for me.
I'm glad you brought that out by yourself, Mr. Porter.
You mean if I'd hidden it, I too would have become a suspect? Well, Mr. Keene, as far as I could...
That sounded like a gun.
It was. It came from the back of your house. Both you gentlemen remain where you are. I'm going out to investigate.
All right, young fella. Just stay where you are.
What's happened, Mike?
Well, Mr. Keene, I heard this fella prowling around in the shrubbery. And when I yelled, he started to run. I fired 2 shots in the air to scare him. He stopped in a hurry.
Well, who are you?
Alan Porter's my name. I thought I was being attacked by a maniac. That's why I tried to run.
You are Ernest Porter's nephew?
Yes.
Mr. Keene, there's a car coming up the road.
Take young Porter back to the house, Mike. I'll join you in just a minute.
Okay, me bucko. Let's go.
Good evening.
Who are you?
My name is Keene.
Oh, the famous investigator. I'm Audrey Stafford.
I'm glad you come, Audrey. I wanted to ask you a few questions in regard to the murder of Martha Langley.
Leave her alone.
I beg your pardon. Oh, it's you, Mrs. Wrightson.
Please, Mrs. Wrightson, I can handle this alone.
Audrey hasn't done anything, Mr. Keene. You have no right to question her.
Aren't you taking a few liberties, considering that Mr. Langley asked me to investigate this case, and you're one of his employees?
Oh, it's not meant as disrespect, Mr. Keene, but... Oh, I've come to look on Miss Audrey as my future mistress, and I want to protect her.
From what? November 10th, 1949, Mr. Keene, Tracer of Lost Persons on Classic Radio Theater with Wyatt Cox. The news from 73 years ago today comes up next. Thank you for tuning in to Classic Radio Theater with Wyatt Cox on this Thursday. We're listening to an episode of Mr. Keene, Tracer of Lost Persons, as it was originally broadcast on Thursday, November 10th, 1949. In the newspapers of that Thursday 73 years ago, these were some of the headlines. The giant U.S. Steel Corporation set up peace talks with the striking CIO United Steelworkers yesterday as another big producer came to terms. The outlook bright for a speedy end of the most costly steel strike in American history. Shortly after disclosure that U.S. Steel is going into contract sessions today, Youngstown Steel, a sheet and tube company, signed on to the union's terms. The Ohio firm, the fourth big steel producer, signed a strike-ending pension and social insurance agreement with the union. Bethlehem Republican Jones and Laughlin signed up previously. John L. Lewis abruptly ended the 52-day soft coal strike yesterday, but said it will start again in 3 weeks unless a contract settlement is reached. In a sharp reversal of the traditional no contract, no work policy, Lewis told his 380,000 striking miners to resume digging coal immediately under the old contract that expired July 1st. Some mines began partial operations at once. The 52-day strike order that ended yesterday was the third longest work stoppage by coal miners in modern history. President Mariano Ospina Perez declared a state of siege in Colombia last night, and troops immediately marched into Bogota to maintain order. Soldiers with machine guns patrolled the streets and halted all automobiles in a search for concealed weapons. The people panic-stricken and began fleeing for the safety of their homes, but later the city was calm. The Air Force announced yesterday its $100 million Air Engineering Development Center will be established at Camp Forest, Tennessee. The research center will be for the development and evaluation of air weapons. The chosen site is 66 miles southeast of Nashville. Air Force Secretary Symington said the site is the choice of the Air Force and was approved by President Truman, Defense Secretary Johnson, and the Research and Development Board. Russia warned in the United Nations yesterday she is ready to trade blow for blow in any new war. Soviet delegate Amzat Archunya told the General Assembly's Political Committee there is no need for any war, but we don't fear any such eventuality. We are well prepared to trade blow for blow. Arjun made the statement in an effort to bar the Western powers from the former Italian colony of Libya, strategic North African territory, which served as a battleground in World War II. An Aurora, Illinois businessman, imbued with the belief that it is more blessed to give than to receive, found yesterday that his desire for anonymity had dissolved in the wake of nationwide attention attracted by his giving away $350,000. He's retired real estate and insurance man, 74-year-old James Powell. He's given away most of his $500,000 fortune to friends and institutions because he wanted to give happiness to others. Powell, identified by his closest friend, K.O. Waldo, to whom he had given $50,000 for construction or purchase of new equipment. Waldo identified Powell through a misunderstanding. Among gifts were $16,000 to St. Joseph's Mercy Hospital, $15,000 to Trinity Episcopal Church, and $5,000 each to Mercyville, Illinois Sanitarium and the Jack and Jill Nursery. When he dies, Powell said the trust fund he's established for his own income will go to charity and friends. And those some of the day's top news stories as reported in the newspapers of Thursday, November 10th, 1949, on your radio, Mr. Keene, Tracer of Lost Persons, which continues now on Classic Radio Theater with Wyatt Cox.
What makes you feel that she needs protection?
You suspect her of being one of Miss Martha's enemies, don't you?
I haven't mentioned that to anyone. Neither has Mr. Langley, I'm sure.
Oh, then I made a mistake. I beg your pardon, Mr. Keene.
However, you're not far from wrong.
What?
I do suspect Miss Audrey.
Mr. Keene, you don't
You can't suspect Miss Audrey.
She admitted to Herbert Langley that his sister Martha was against their marriage, and that alone could be construed as motive enough for murder.
Don't say it, Mr. Keene. Don't say that word.
Mother, please, Mother, don't.
Audrey, did you say mother?
She lied. I'm not her mother.
That won't help, Mrs. Wrightson. It ties in with your strange desire to protect someone who should be almost a stranger to you. So, Audrey is your daughter.
No one knew. Up to now.
There are many more things that are still concealed in this murder case, Mrs. Wrightson, but I intend to bring them all to the surface, and at the same time bring Martha Langley's killer to justice.
In just a moment, we'll return to Mr. Keene and the engaged girl murder case. Meanwhile...
Well, from 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time, Thursday, November 10th, 1949, Mr. Keene, Tracer of Lost Persons. We'll hear the conclusion in just a moment on this Thursday, Classic Radio Theater with Wyatt Cox on your favorite radio station. On Friday's Classic Radio Theater with Wyatt Cox, we'll go back 66 years to November 11th, 1956, an episode of the CBS Radio Workshop, Report on the Weans, a portrait of our culture as it might appear to those 6,000 years in the future. Of course, 6,000 years from November 11th, 1956. And a lot of the stuff, well, gives you an idea how things were 66 years ago, as much as it would to those people 6,000 years in the future. That's on Friday's Classic Radio Theater with Wyatt Cox. But now the conclusion of Mr. Keene, Tracer of Lost Persons, 73 years ago today, November 10th, 1949.
Now back to Mr. Keene and the engaged girl murder case. The murder of wealthy Martha Langley brings Mr. Keene, the great investigator, and his partner, Mike Clancy, to the fabulous Langley estate in Connecticut, where Mr. Keene begins a difficult investigation. He has just discovered that Mrs. Wrightson, the Langley housekeeper, is actually the mother of Audrey Stafford, who is about to marry the victim's brother, Herbert. After learning of this startling revelation on the driveway in front of Herbert Langley's palatial home, Mr. Keene continues to question Mrs. Wrightson and Audrey in the hope of obtaining further information.
Mrs. Wrightson, I advise you to be truthful with me if you really want to protect your daughter, Audrey.
As long as you know my secret, Mr. Keene, I'll tell you everything. But not in front of Audrey.
You shouldn't have made me keep that secret, Mother. I wanted Herbert to know about it.
Please, dear. Let me speak to Mr. Keene alone for a few minutes.
Very well, Mother.
Audrey, you'll find your fiancé, Herbert Langley, in the house, along with his neighbors, Mr. Porter and his nephew, Alan.
I'll talk to you later, Mother.
Yes, darling. Mr. Keene, there's one thing you must understand. My daughter, Audrey, is no snob. She pleaded desperately with me to allow her to tell Mr. Langley I was her mother.
And why didn't you?
I thought it would hurt her marriage, at least socially, since I'm Mr. Langley's housekeeper. I was so happy knowing she'd get those things in life I always dreamed she'd have. Wealth, social position, and happiness.
Go on, Mrs. Wrightson.
It was easy to keep the secret as far as our names were concerned. I married twice. Audrey's name is Stafford, but I kept the name of my second husband, John Wrightson. I did it thinking that one day I might not want Audrey to admit that her mother was poor and ordinary.
I wouldn't call your love for your daughter ordinary, Mrs. Wrightson.
Her meeting with Herbert Langley was just a coincidence. I came here to work as his housekeeper after Audrey left on her cruise to Bermuda, and she didn't know about my new job until she got back. Then I cautioned her to say nothing about it to Mr. Langley.
I see. Is there anything else you'd like to tell me, Mrs. Wrightson?
Only that Herbert Langley wasn't the only millionaire who wanted to marry Audrey.
Who else was there?
Alan Porter. He was mad about her. And he's very rich, Mr. Keene, a well-known polo player. He wanted to marry Audrey, too. But she loves Herbert. And Martha Langley, Alan Porter, and his uncle all together couldn't change that love.
How do you mean, Mrs. Wrightson? Did they try to stop the marriage?
Mr. Keene, 2 hours before Martha Langley's body was found, I happened to pass by the Chinese tea house.
The Chinese tea house?
It's a small cottage on the estate over there in the woods. Inside the tea house, Martha Langley, Mr. Porter, and Alan were having a conversation.
What were they saying, Mrs. Wrightson?
Mr. Porter was saying that Audrey and his nephew Alan would make a good match. Martha Langley seemed to be irritated. She asked young Alan why he hadn't been able to win Audrey away from her brother.
And what was Alan's answer?
He didn't have time to answer, Mr. Keene. That moment, my daughter Audrey walked into the tea house, so they changed the conversation.
It's very interesting, Mrs. Wrightson. It puts a new aspect on the case.
What do you mean, Mr. Keene?
I'll explain later. Meanwhile, would you please ask my partner, Mike Clancy, to meet me inside the Chinese tea house immediately and tell him it's very important. Mike.
Is that you, Mr. Keene?
I'm over here on the tea house porch.
Sure, this is certainly a fancy shack, isn't it, boss? Why, it looks like something from a Chinese palace.
Mike, come inside for a moment. I want to show you something. Oh, look at this.
Saints preserve us. Like someone must have tried to tear the house down, Mr. Keene. There's a hole right through the wall.
The walls are flimsy, Mike, but they've been reinforced with short, narrow beams. That's the one part of this tea house that isn't authentically Chinese. One of those wooden beams, small but solid, has been pulled out right here.
Mr. Keene, that missing piece of wood could have been the murder weapon.
Exactly. And here's something else, Mike.
Why, it's a bit of cloth.
I found it hanging on this nail head, here where the beam was torn out. Now, if you wanted to tear a beam out of this wall with the aid of a chisel, say, how would you brace yourself?
Well, I'd stick my knee up against the wall on this side for leverage.
That's just what the killer did, Mike. But he unknowingly left this bit of cloth on the head of that nail. This bit of cloth comes from heavy riding breeches. So the killer probably never even scratched himself or herself.
Herself?
Well, nowadays, women wear heavy riding breeches too, Mike.
Yeah, but Mr. Keene, that still leaves us with the job of picking out the killer. Several people were riding that day when Martha Langley was murdered.
I know that. However, I think I have an idea. Tomorrow morning, Mike, we'll all go riding here on the Langley estate and turn my murder theory into a fact.
Mr. Keene, would you like to ride with Audrey and me? We're going through the woods.
No, you better ride on ahead of us, Mr. Langley. My partner, Mike Clancy, and I will join you in a few minutes.
All right, Mr. Keene. Come on, Audrey.
Well, horses ain't exactly in my line, boss, but I'll try to keep up with you.
You ride very well, Mike.
Well, not half as good as you do. Hold up there, you old burner. Take it easy. Well, sure, they were all pretty curious about why you wanted to take that ride this morning.
My reason paid dividends, Mike.
It did, boss?
Yeah, I know who murdered Martha Langley. All I need now is proof of how it was done. That's what... Here comes Alan Porter.
Mr. Keene.
Yes, Alan?
I don't know why you suggested this ride, but I feel I owe you an explanation.
Of what?
Last night, when Mr. Clancy fired at me, I wasn't prowling. I only...
Well, it was a natural mistake in all our parts, Alan. But you seem to take it more seriously than it warrants.
Well, I just wanted you to know that I'm being honest, and I have nothing to hide. I'll see you later, Mr. Keene.
Sure, and he sounded like a young man with a guilty conscience, boss.
You might have a very good reason for that, Mike. I found out last night, after seeing a picture of the murdered girl, Martha Langley, that she and Audrey were the same height and often wore identical riding habits.
Well, what does that mean, sir?
Alan realizes that I may know that Audrey refused his proposal of marriage, and so may have wanted to take revenge.
You mean that he may have killed the wrong girl because they looked alike in their riding clothes?
Yes, it's possible. Mike, do you see that thicket over there under the apple tree?
That's where Martha Langley's body was found.
Seeing it gave me an idea. Here, let's get near the tree.
Oh.
All right, Mike. Right here. Would you mind dismounting?
It'll be a pleasure to get off this nag, boss. Oh, there. Oh! Why, the critter ran away.
We'll round him up later. Mike, the lowest branch of this tree is just a little above the head of a rider on horseback. Climb up there and I'll explain what I'm getting at.
Well, I'll do my best, boss. From riding horses to tree climbing, as preservers, the investigating business is sure getting to be strenuous.
That's good work, Mike. Now, unless I look up and peer very carefully through the branches, I wouldn't see you.
Well, then, Mr. Keene, the killer could swing from here in the tree and, as his victim came by on horseback, hit her on the head.
Yes, Mike. I'm convinced that's the way it was done.
But who was the murderer, boss?
He seems to be joining us right now. Be quiet, Mike. Stay up there in the tree, out of sight. Tired of riding with the others, Mr. Porter?
What are you doing here, Mr. Keene?
Solving a murder. That's why you decided to see what I was up to.
What do you mean?
The man I intend to arrest for Martha Langley's murder is you, Porter.
You think you can prove that I killed Martha?
Very easily. I have a tiny piece of cloth torn from your riding breeches when you pulled your murder weapon, a wooden beam out of the tea house wall. And there's the hole in your breeches. I saw it just before we left the house.
Don't spur your horse, Keene, or I'll shoot you out of the saddle.
That gun won't help, Porter.
The others are riding half a mile away by now, and you seem to have lost your partner, too. I think this gun may help a great deal.
Why did you kill Martha Langley?
I don't mind telling you. You'll never get a chance to pass it on to anyone else. I killed Martha to protect myself, Keene.
Protect yourself? How?
5 years ago, my brother left $2 million to his son, Alan, and made me his guardian until he came of age. Alan comes of age tomorrow. He's 21.
Did you steal his inheritance?
No, I spent it. I knew how to enjoy it. And not only spent most of that money, but I left it in some of the most fashionable gambling houses in the world.
And how did you think you'd get away with it when your nephew Alan became of age?
It would have been simple if it wasn't for Martha Langley. I was going to tell Alan his parents lost the money in those gambling houses, and that I kept it from him all these years just to save their reputations.
But Martha Langley found out the truth?
Yes. She made a deal, though. Said if I could get my nephew Alan to marry Audrey, she'd keep my secret and add $50,000 in the bargain.
But you didn't succeed.
No, that fool nephew of mine was crazy about Audrey, but she fell for Herbert Langley.
I think I know the rest, Porter.
Do you?
Martha Langley became angry when you couldn't fulfill your part of the bargain. It was her only hope of separating her brother from Audrey. You thought she'd give you away, and you killed her to prevent that.
The way I'm killing you, Keene, right now.
Look out, boss!
Good work, Mike. Wait a minute, I'll dismount.
He's out cold, Mr. Keene. When I hopped on his head from that branch, I fell right on top of him, and he hit the ground first.
Yes, Mike. Porter met justice on the same spot he committed his crime. He lured Martha Langley over here when she became separated from the others. Probably by calling her as he crouched in the tree. And then he struck from above. Now he'll pay for his treachery in a court of law.
So Mr. Keene finds the solution to the engaged girl murder case. Mr. Keene, Tracer of Lost Persons, is based on the novel Mr. Keene. The radio sequel is originated and produced by Frank and Ann Hummert. Dialogue by Lawrence Clee. Bennett Kilpack plays Mr. Keene. It is on the air every Thursday at this time. Don't miss Mr. Keene next Thursday when the kindly old tracer turns to the concrete cellar murder case.
The Hummerts produced a lot of radio programs. We'll tell you about that on another time. Mr. Keene, Tracer of Lost Persons, from 73 years ago, November 10th, 1949, here on Classic Radio Theater with Wyatt Cox. Take a moment to thank this radio station and support their advertisers. It's their kindness and courtesy that allows us to be with you each and every time you roll around here on your favorite station. Miss a day, you don't have to miss a single show. You can find all of our shows at classicradio.stream. That's classicradio.stream. Stream our shows, learn more about classic radio collecting, contact me, find our social media links. If you like what we do, buy me a coffee. I'm Wyatt Cox. Thanks for tuning in. That's classicradio.stream. Tell your friends the great radio shows are right here at this spot on the dial. Classic Radio Theater with Wyatt Cox on your favorite station.